If I wanted to mass produce ClusterB psychology at scale, I'd separate children from extended family, raise them in nuclear units with no elders. I'd make both parents work full time so the kids are raised by institutions or screens. I'd fragment the parents' attention with economic anxiety so they can't be consistently present. That creates the insecure attachment that's core to ClusterB. To add to that, I would design technology that rewards performance over substance, that makes identity into something you can curate rather than something you discover. I'd make validation contingent on constant external feedback, likes, shares, views. That creates the narcissistic vulnerability and identity instability. So I'd accelerate everything, speed up communication, speed up information flow, advance cultural change so fast that nobody has time to integrate anything. No time to reflect, no time to digest, no time for consequences to fully land. That creates the impulsivity. I'd collapse all the traditional containers for initiation and replace them with nothing except consumerism and therapeutic language that keeps people perpetually processing their wounds without ever transforming through them. Now, I'm getting clients who've been in therapy. They're coming to me because they're not getting the transformation they need. They're getting nice therapeutic language. So I would do all of this while telling people, hey, you know what? You're more free, you're more connected, you're more evolved than any previous generation. I'd make it invisible. That's the genius of it. We can't see what's being done to us because we're so bloody convinced it's progress. Honestly, when I map it out like that, I get chills because it's not conspiracy, it's emergence. We've all felt it, the way conversations collapse into reactivity within seconds. I'm watching stuff on YouTube and I'm thinking, wow, these crowds are turning feral over what? Have our nervous systems become hijacked by something we didn't consent to? The way wisdom has become almost unavailable, even to people actively seeking it. Exploring this thesis, circulating in certain psychological and cultural circles, modern civilization has essentially become dominated by what's clinically called ClusterB personality adaptations. Not as individual pathology anymore, it's the default psychological operating system of our entire culture. If that's true, even if partially true, then we are facing something far more dangerous than political polarization or social media addiction. We're facing the potential loss of our capacity for wisdom itself right at the moment when we most need it. One of the things with this, and I was thinking about this quite deeply when you sent that through and I'd read the literature, I don't want to stay at the psychological level. I want to go deeper than that, almost down to the cosmological roots of what's happening. What we're really looking at isn't just a mind virus or a cultural dysfunction. I wonder whether we're looking at the death throes of an entire worldview, an entire way of being human, and potentially the birth of something we can barely imagine yet. Before anyone panics or feels like, oh, not another doom and gloom prophecy, I want to be clear, this isn't a diagnosis designed to judge or pathologize anyone. It's a mirror. Because if ClusterB traits like volatility, identity, fragmentation, impulsivity, emotional contagion, grandiosity, victim-perpetrator cycling become the waters we're all swimming in, then surely every one of us is affected, including us, including people listening right now. I wonder where the hope comes in. Does it come in from the very fact that we can see this pattern, that we can name it, that we can have this conversation, which means we're not completely possessed by it? Because consciousness of the problem, I see as the first portal or doorway to transformation. The soul can witness its own wounding and it can heal itself. So I want to move through this in a specific way. One of the ways I'd like to move through it with you is to look at what's actually happening at the material and psychological level, the conditions that have created this, and then explore why this particular psychology spread so effectively now, then go deeper into what this does to consciousness itself, to the soul's capacity to mature, and then look at the practices that might create a different circuitry. And finally, this is where we're going to go all the way to the core to look at what's happening at the cosmological level, what's actually dying and what might be trying to be born. I'd like it to be raw, unfiltered, maybe uncomfortable, but to look at it directly together and to hold the possibility that looking directly at the wound is how healing begins.
I see this as a sort of intervention. I think there's a number of us who are familiar when it comes to addiction. One sign of an addict is denial. If we want to course correct with the addiction, there needs to be a contrast, and that would be acceptance and veritas. The truth shall set you free. I feel that the acceptance and what we're going to go over is probably something at least 90, if not 180 degrees from the current mass momentum trajectory. And so it's a form of medicine, and sometimes medicine is tough to swallow, but it's for our own good. And we're not alone in this. C.S. Lewis is coming to my mind. What did he say? That human nature will be the last part of nature to surrender to man. The battle will then be won. We shall have taken the thread of life out of the hand of Clotho, and be henceforth free to make our species whatever we wish it to be. The battle will indeed be won, but who precisely will have won it?
It's important to set the container. How did we get here? Because there are material conditions at a ground level reality. These ClusterB traits don't appear out of nowhere. Clinically, they develop in response to specific childhood conditions, early relational trauma, inconsistent caregiving, chaotic environments, attachment wounds. The child's nervous system learns that stability is a lie and that identity must be fluid to survive, and that emotional intensity is the only reliable way to get needs met. Here's what I see as the uncomfortable part of it. Those conditions, instability, fragmentation, overstimulation, relational chaos, the collapse of consistent caregiving, these aren't happening in individual families anymore. They're scaled to civilization itself. So we're raising children in conditions that are fundamentally cluster B, generating at a mass level.
It's exponential. I would say it's a product of the machine. It's a product of modernity. It's hyper novel. What's coming to my mind is evolutionary psychology or evolutionary biology. The principle of EEA, environmental evolutionary adaptedness. So 100 to 300,000 years or so of the history of our species has been that of nomadic hunter-gatherers, a familial community of perhaps 30 upwards to 100 people that you're related with. So the modern world is hyper novel to that template model, that 90% of the human experience. We're adapting, but it's a maladaptation. So when I said that we're not alone in this matter, you mentioned mirror early on in our conversation. The mirror is also outside of our species. We can see this chaos loosed upon the biosphere.
You stated scale to civilization itself. If I was to be specific about looking through a material lens, if you think about the material conditions of modern life, we're raising children in nuclear families with no extended family present, no elders, no uncles and aunts, no intergenerational transmission of wisdom. Both parents typically work full time out of economic necessity. So children are being raised by institutions or screens. The parents themselves are chronically stressed and economically stretched. They cannot predict whether their job will exist in 5 years, or whether they can afford healthcare, or whether their children will be able to afford housing. I'm seeing that here in the UK. You've got 30-year-olds still living at home. They can't get on the housing ladder. Now, that anxiety has got to live somewhere. It lives in their bodies, and children's nervous systems absorb it. The layer on top of that, the technological reality, you've got algorithmic feeds designed not to inform, but to addict. Social media platforms that reward emotional intensity and punish nuance. So attention spans have been systematically fragmented by devices engineered to interrupt every few seconds. The replacement of embodied community with digital performance, where identity becomes something you can curate rather than discover through a lived relationship. And economically, we've created a system that rewards impulsivity and short-term thinking. Companies that plan beyond the next quarter are punished by shareholders. Politicians who think beyond the next election cycle lose power. Individuals who try to build slowly, carefully, with patience are economically disadvantaged compared to those who move fast and break things. When I read Scale to Civilization, the very structure of how we live today, economically, technologically, socially, relationally, I see generates the exact conditions that clinically produce cluster B adaptations in individuals. So we've built a cluster B generating machine and we've called it progress. That's got to be deeply unsettling.
Mary Shelley would probably name it the Frankenstein's monster. What you're describing, how can one not think that this is going to create a state of perpetual fight, flight, or freeze, sympathetic nervous system dominance? And you mentioned the economy. That is a key focal point, especially within the media. The economy goes hand in hand, technology, AI nowadays, politics. I would say that's about 90 or so percent of the conversation, of the hourly, daily, 24/7, 365 conversation, when there's parts of the world that are literally dying before our eyes, much of it due to our own hand. I did mention C.S. Lewis in the beginning. Human nature will be the last part of nature to surrender to man. Us being the last to fall victim to ourselves, the living planet was the first.
These conditions have been normalized. We don't see them as problematic anymore.
They're common. There's nothing normal
No,
about this.
exactly. But this is where it gets disturbing. There's a feedback loop because, so logically, if you have a dysregulated culture produces dysregulated children who become dysregulated adults who create more dysregulation. So the loop intensifies through trauma inheritance, through the collapse of a family structure, through the loss of elders, through the disappearance of initiation, through the fragmentation of community, and through being economically stretched, through the fact that meaning collapses, attention collapses. This isn't even linear decay. This is a runaway psychosocial infection. As you rightly said, it's a mind virus rewriting the psychological DNA of our species. When you look at your nervous system in these conditions, not as theory, but as lived experience, what do we notice?
So the nervous system is very intelligent. Its chief role is to keep us alive long enough to perpetuate the genes. So take pain, for instance. The longer and the more one experiences pain, the nervous system adapts, and guess what? It gets better at perceiving pain. It becomes hypersensitive. What's coming to mind is what's called central sensitization. Are you familiar
Yeah,
with that?
yeah.
So imagine central sensitization when it comes to the mythos, to the culture, the collective unconscious. When I work with people with their wellness, they've had a lot of trauma, chronic pain, allostatic load. That's a high amount of sympathetic nervous system stress. It's catabolic. They're not sleeping well, etc. Central sensitization, in my experience working with clients in that context, takes on average 1 to 2 years to shift the scales in the nervous system and to recalibrate and be able to have the awareness, this ongoing practice of self-regulation. That takes work. It takes more energy to break the inertia from the momentum and trajectory of the high stress, catabolic, inflammatory state. In order to course correct, it takes more energy and just as much time or to turn that around.
What you're highlighting is fragmentation. That's what I notice with clients. And a particular client that comes to mind, her attention span has been colonized. So this person sits down to write something, let's say, that requires depth. And within minutes, they're checking email, maybe the news, following some thread that leads nowhere. It's not that they lack discipline, it's that their nervous system has been rewired to expect constant stimulation. Hence, you're talking about turning that around. So the capacity for sustained attention, which is foundational for any wisdom work, it's been eroded. So it's not that they lack discipline. Their nervous system has been rewired to expect constant stimulation. So the capacity for sustained attention is foundational for any wisdom work. So they have to fight for it now in a way that maybe 20 years ago they didn't have to. The other thing I notice is a kind of a low-grade anxiety that never resolves. What I've identified in several clients is that it's not about anything specific. When we drill down, I can't quite put my finger on it, but what I have found it's environmental. It's in the air. What do I mean by that? The economic instability, the sense that everything could shift overnight, the absence of elders who can say, I've been through this, here's what matters. All of that and more creates a chronic background dysregulation. So their systems are always slightly on alert, slightly braced for impact. When you're operating from that state chronically, wisdom becomes almost inaccessible because wisdom requires a certain quality of spaciousness, of settledness. You can't access deep knowing when you're perpetually activated. If we were to deliberately design a civilization to produce ClusterB psychology at scale,
we've done it.
That's the thing that haunts me.
Wisdom comes by way of the right brain. Much of the present day world, for wisdom to occur, requires at least 90, if not 180 degrees from the current trajectory.
Something I was thinking about, if I wanted to mass produce ClusterB psychology at scale, I'd separate children from extended family, raise them in nuclear units with no elders. I'd make both parents work full time so the kids are raised by institutions or screens. I'd fragment the parents' attention with economic anxiety so they can't be consistently present. That creates the insecure attachment that's core to ClusterB. To add to that, I would design technology that rewards performance over substance, that makes identity into something you can curate rather than something you discover. I'd make validation contingent on constant external feedback, likes, shares, views. That creates the narcissistic vulnerability and identity instability. So I'd accelerate everything, speed up communication, speed up information flow, advance cultural change so fast that nobody has time to integrate anything, no time to reflect, no time to digest, no time for consequences to fully land. That creates the impulsivity. I'd collapse all the traditional containers for initiation and replace them with nothing except consumerism and therapeutic language that keeps people perpetually processing their wounds without ever transforming through them. Now, I'm getting clients who've been in therapy. They're coming to me because they're not getting the transformation they need. They're getting nice therapeutic language. So I would do all of this while telling people, hey, you know what? You're more free, you're more connected, you're more evolved than any previous generation. I'd make it invisible. That's the genius of it. We can't see what's being done to us because we're so bloody convinced it's progress. Honestly, when I map it out like that, I get chills because it's not conspiracy, it's emergence. The system we've created is perfectly optimized to produce exactly the psychology it's producing. Would you agree?
Absolutely. This has been said before in different ways. Joseph Campbell's coming to my mind. He said something along the lines that the state, the machine are one and the same. Are we going to become an agent in servitude machine? That doesn't come from the heart, serving the machine. The machine only cares about itself. It's not concerned about humanity. Serving humanity comes from the heart. I would also say probably more of the right brain and less of the left brain. And that service to the machine is probably more of the left brain than the right brain. What you described moments ago, we've created in our serving fast food for the soul. Fast food isn't very nutritious, is it? It's very profitable, though, isn't it? In service to the machine. Tolkien saw this early on in the 20th century in his experience in the trenches of World War I. What he wrote years later was therapeutic for him and perhaps a mirror of some of his earlier life's experiences. He wrote this: "The world has changed. I see it in the water. I feel it in the earth. I smell it in the air. Much that once was is lost, for none now live who remember it." That's that wisdom, right? The world has changed, but many of us are blind to that. We mistake as normal. This is far from normal.
This isn't actually new. To cite a reference, James Hillman, the archetypal psychologist, talked about soul making through pathology. And this is the idea that psychological wounding can serve the soul's development. But, and this is crucial, pathology can only serve soul when it's held by something larger, when there's a container strong enough to metabolize it. But when the entire container is pathologized, when the culture itself is the wound, there's nothing to hold it. The pathology just breeds not more pathways, but more pathology. Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist, warned us about collective possession by the shadow when the majority of individuals are operating from wounded, reactive consciousness. The collective shadow doesn't stay in the background, it becomes the foreground. It's the waters we're swimming in, the default. Now, when that happens, we are quickly losing the capacity, or maybe we've lost the capacity to see it because there's nothing outside of it to see from. But I'm optimistic and I look at where can hope enter? Because every one of these traditions also understood that recognizing the possession is the beginning of freedom from it. The demon loses power when you can name it. We're in the naming phase right now. And I think this conversation is part of that naming.
What did Jesus say to that one possessed man? Leave him. So having that awareness, it's the acceptance that, yes, there is a problem and we're able to identify it. What's the counterbalance to darkness? Light. So in recognizing this, much of what we're describing is a product of us humans, thoughts, words, actions, and thoughts can become things. From the Hebrew, abracadabra, I create as I speak. That can go in both directions, can it not? If we want something that's the best, good, beauty, and truth, and not just for us, but for all of our relations on this living planet that we share and live with, then we can create some light as well. Hopefully, a little bit more than the darkness. As Joseph Campbell said, all the gods, all the heavens, all the hells are within us. So having that acceptance that both those potentialities are within us. What do we want? Choose. Go from there, because this current trajectory, more of the same equals more of the same. So it's not going to end well if we continue on as we've been. And we might survive physically as a species, but I would say more likely we'll lose what remains of our humanity and soul, and we'll just be a shell of ourselves. The living world will also follow. It'll be a wasteland, as T.S. Eliot wrote about in, I think, 1922 or 1925, T.S. Eliot's poem, The Wasteland. When I mentioned Tolkien earlier, the first decade or so of the 20th century, 1914, World War I, and then its cousin, World War II, I see those 2 points and much of the 20th century as a force multiplier to this separation from the sacred, this disintegration, and yes, disintegration of the soul. It was a force multiplier because you mentioned progress, and many of the regimes of the 20th century thought they were moving towards a utopia, which the translation of that means no place. But with that type of thinking and perhaps mind virus thinking, tragically, that resulted anywhere from 100 to 200 million deaths.
This is the mechanism of contagion. I read a quote the other day and it said, when we neglect what matters to us, that then becomes the matter with us. I want to take a moment to look at why this particular psychology spread so effectively. What I've found in my research is quite disturbing, because ClusterB doesn't just survive in chaos, it thrives in it. And more than that, it spreads faster than any other psychological adaptation. Now, we know there are 4 personality clusters in clinical psychology. Cluster A is paranoid, withdrawn, schizoid. It survives through isolation. Cluster C is anxious, rigid, over-controlled. It survives through freezing and hypervigilance, but both depend on stability. So when chaos hits, they collapse inward. But cluster B is fast, flexible, emotionally expressive, and intensely relational. So it develops quicker responses to instability. It adapts quicker when conditions change, and it synchronizes with other nervous systems instantly through emotional contagion. So in a volatile environment, those traits become evolutionary advantages. Flexibility outcompetes rigidity. Emotional expressiveness outcompetes withdrawal. This is the psychological equivalent of a virus perfectly adapted to its host environment. And this is what I find really disturbing, is that it doesn't just infect individuals, it rewires social fields.
We're social beings. That's how we move through life.
Have you noticed how fast emotional states spread now? Someone posts on social media, and within minutes, you might have hundreds or thousands of people in the same state. That's not just algorithms, though they amplify it. That's nervous system synchronization at scale. Cluster B traits include high emotional expressiveness and unstable identity boundaries. Those traits make someone incredibly attuned to others' emotional states. It's a survival mechanism developed in chaotic childhoods when you had to constantly read the room to stay safe. People with strong cluster B adaptations are like emotional tuning forks. They resonate with whatever frequency is dominant in their environment. In group settings, this creates a feedback loop. It's an echo chamber. When I was speaking with a client the other day, what we identified, she was feeling very anxious, but it wasn't her anxiety, it was her partner's anxiety. So one person's anxiety activates another's anxiety, which amplifies back to the first, which spreads to a third. The emotional state synchronizes across the group. Individual boundaries start dissolving and people stop thinking critically and independently. They start feeling collectively. Once that synchronization reaches a certain threshold, the group almost becomes like one huge nervous system. That's what we're seeing today. That's when mobs form. That's when riots erupt. That's when entire populations shift into collective rage or panic, which seemingly overnight. Now, the Greeks had a term for this. It was called ati, which means, it's spelled ate, which is divine madness. It's a state where the gods cloud your judgment and drive you toward destruction. So when you're in ati, you make catastrophic decisions that seem absolutely right in the moment, and you cannot see the delusion until after the damage is done. But the terrifying part is that ate can possess entire populations simultaneously. So everyone becoming deluded in the same way. We're seeing the same mechanism now, except the God is the algorithm and the possession happens through screens.
It's Frankenstein's monster, and we are its creator, but it's our master. This has happened before. There was dancing plagues in Europe, parts of Europe during the Middle Ages. Carl Jung, he wrote about this. He described it as a demon possession of sorts. In social dynamics, all that you need for this, as far as the number of people in order for this to happen, is a critical mass, 20% or so.
Yeah.
You mentioned children a number of times, especially in the formative years and they're developing. I see this as a form of mental, emotional, and perhaps spiritual child abuse. We spoke about him during our earlier talk or a week or so on love. Lloyd Demas, I believe he was the founder of psychohistory, looking at the psyche of us humans culturally throughout history, and his writings, The Origins of War and Child Abuse, the relationship of child abuse and war between nations. We're having a war with our psyche, with our remaining humanity, and in some cases, war with each other, in groups, out groups, unfortunately still to this day, nations. And then we also have another war that many people perhaps don't consider, that is the war against the living planet.
I was reflecting on what I was describing, and you're right about all of those things. I can feel my own susceptibility because when I scroll, and I don't scroll a lot, but when I do, and I see everyone outraged, I can feel my system starting to sync up before I've even fully understood what I'm supposed to be angry about. Can you catch it happening? Can you feel the moment your nervous system starts to surrender to the collective wave? Because there's usually a window, maybe 2 or 3 seconds, where you still have choice. But once you're fully synchronized, you're gone, you're possessed. And in that state, you're actually convinced you're right. You cannot see that something has hijacked you. Referring back to Carl Jung, who had a term for this, which was participation mystique, which is the original unconscious identity between self and other, between individual and collective. But in healthy development, we differentiate. We develop strong ego boundaries so we know where we end and where others begin. But what we're seeing now is mass regression to participation mystique in its toxic form, where people's boundaries are so weak, they simply absorb whatever emotional state is dominant around them, constantly dissolving into the crowd with no stable self that can observe the dissolution. There are certain things that keep me up at night. One of them is how much what I think is me is only absorbed from the collective atmosphere. How many of my views, my certainties, my positions are genuinely mine versus downloaded from whatever's psychologically dominant in my behavior. That's disturbing to me because once you start asking that question, I realize I can't be certain about much of anything.
Socrates.
Exactly. But this is where mythological understanding becomes essential. The ancient Greeks wrote about this in the Bacchae, which was a tragedy by Euripides, where the god Dionysus returns to Thebes and possesses the women of the city, turning them into maenads or raving ones, frenzied followers who abandon their homes, they run wild into the mountains and eventually tear King Pentheus limb from limb with their bare hands. When the
Mm.
possession lifts, his mother, Agave, realizes she's holding her own son's head, thinking it was a lion because she has no
Mm.
memory of what she did while possessed. So the god Dionysus possesses the women of Thebes and they become maenads. They lose all individual consciousness and become a unified force. The terrifying part isn't the violence. It's that afterward they have no memory of it. They were gone. Something else was operating through them. We're seeing the same mechanism now. People do things in crowds, physical or digital, that they would never do as individuals. And afterwards, they often can't explain why. I hear these things like, oh, I don't know what came over me. That's not metaphor. That's a possession by a collective psychological state.
Archetypal force.
Exactly. But here's where hope enters, because the Greeks also understood that these forces could be honored, ritualized, and contained. Because Dionysian energy is not evil, it's a necessary part of the human psyche. The dissolution of ego boundaries, the ecstatic merger with something larger, that's essential for certain kinds of transformation and creativity and spiritual experience. The problem isn't the energy itself. The problem is we don't have any containers for it anymore. We've dismantled all the rituals, all the initiations, all the sacred structures that allowed these forces to move through communities in ways that were transformative rather than destructive. So now what we're seeing is the energy erupts chaotically, possessing people and populations with no elders, no ritual boundaries, and no way to metabolize it safely. So I don't see the solution is to eliminate these energies. We have to rebuild the containers that can hold them. That's one of the most hopeful insights I have.
Wisdom, once again. The poison's in the dose. It's like the seasons. It's the right time and the right place for the right reason. That's how nature operates. Joseph Campbell said something along the lines is that one of the purposes of us humans is to match our heartbeat with the heartbeat of nature and that of the cosmos.
What a beautiful thought.
When you have good beauty and truth, it's undeniable. It's not something so much from us, the machine, it's more of the sacred, I would say. It's more of the right brain, the whole, returning back to our wholeness, our humanness, with the whole tapestry of life and that of the cosmos.
This isn't a problem to solve by returning to some imagined past or transcending into some disembodied future. It's a problem we address by doing what humans have always done. When we're healthy, we're creating ritual containers, we're building initiatory structures, we're establishing sacred boundaries that allow powerful forces to move through us in ways that serve life as distinct from destroying it. Now, as you alluded to earlier, that's real work. That's the work of our generation, not therapy, not content creation, not even meditation necessarily, but the rebuilding of collective containers for transformation. Every person who does their own regulation work, who learns to catch their own possession states, know thyself, who builds their capacity to hold intensity without acting out, every one of those people is contributing to the reconstruction of the container. One becomes a pillar in the temple that doesn't exist yet, but it desperately needs to.
What comes to mind is transcendence, transcendence of the soul, not the type of transcendence that some people might be thinking of and striving towards for today. Some people might be having in their minds a technological, a biotechnological sorts of transcendence, thus the transhumanism movement. That's not the type of transcendence. That's going to be more a product of the machine and the modern world. And the modern world, the product of the machine is the wound, is the trauma. So if we want something less traumatic, yes, going back to what you were mentioning earlier, that type of transcendence and being a pillar, perhaps being a carpenter, perhaps being a gardener to tend the garden. You mentioned therapy. And some people, their view of therapy is to fix, to get rid of something. I feel this is perhaps related with what you're outlining. Rather than taking a pill, oh, I'm just going to get rid of and fix. I guess there's a time and a place for that. Those are tools, but I would say ultimately a practice of consecration. Consecrate the wound, consecrate the trauma, re-sanctify, re-enliven, revitalize.
This is something I mentioned before, the mechanic and the gardener. The mechanic wants to fix it, and you need mechanics in this world. But if we are over reliant on mechanics, we never become gardeners. We never cultivate the soil for our human skills to take root, to bloom, to cross pollinate, to germinate. There is an assault and battery on the human anatomy. I'm sure that's a song somewhere from earlier times on wisdom, because what dies when this dominates? What dies when ClusterB dominance becomes the water we swim in?
Humanity and the world, that's what dies.
Yeah, but it's not only about social fragmentation or political polarization. This is about the loss of wisdom itself. Without wisdom, we don't survive, neither as individuals, nor as a species, nor as a planet. Wisdom requires four things that modern ClusterB dominance actively destroys. First, as you alluded to, wisdom is right-brained. It's holistic, it's relational, it's symbolic, it's attuned to pattern and depth and the sacred. Modern culture has enthroned the left brain, literal, reductionist, mechanistic, defensive, and it's exiled the right. So when the right brain goes offline, wisdom becomes impossible. Secondly, wisdom requires time, deep time, the kind where you watch patterns unfold across seasons and years and generations. But because we live algorithmic, velocity now, everything is
Time.
immediate, it's reactive, it's urgent. So wisdom cannot form in that environment. Thirdly, wisdom requires lived experience, not informational data or theory, but actual embodied consequence. It's visceral. You learn wisdom by touching fire, by failing, by being humbled by reality. But modern life is increasingly abstract. It's virtual. It's simulated. So we're drowning in information while starving for experience. Fourthly, and I find this the hardest, is that wisdom requires suffering, not trauma, but suffering that's held consciously, but endured with meaning. Every wisdom tradition I've seen teaches this. Suffering consciously metabolized becomes compassion, humility, and depth. But our civilization is designed to avoid suffering at all costs. That's the mechanic. We sedate it, we distract from it, we deny it, we bypass it. And in doing so, we bypass wisdom itself. This lands hard for me because wisdom has become so rare.
I would say early in the human experience, it was the opposite. One of the early known stories within humanity, going back to antiquity, is Homer's The Odyssey. The journey of Odysseus. There was a bit of suffering, humility. He attained some wisdom, some insight. Once again, the same theme in a different part of the world, in a different time period, the Arthurian story, and the time and the bit of suffering that a Percival within his quest of the Holy Grail. He was stripped of his hubris, of his armor, of his mask, his persona. He asked the Fisher King the right question. Therefore, he was able to attain the Grail and help to heal the king and help to heal the land. And the question was, what ails thee? What does the Grail serve? Who does it serve? I guess in some ways, whether to borrow from Jung, you mentioned him a number of times today too, is that whether seen or unseen, God is present. And he probably had a very good reason why he put that over his doorway of his home in Lake Zurich. It's also inscribed on his tombstone. This is present whether we see this or not. Are we going to go into the depths? Are we going to go more toward the right hemisphere of the brain? Perhaps venture into the depths of the underworld and bring back, like Odysseus, or something along the lines of Percival. We're in our own odyssey, we're in our own Grail quest, whether seen or unseen. However, are we going to come back whole? Are we going to ask the right questions? Are we going to help heal the wounded king, the wounded culture, and perhaps the land? The Grail isn't a thing, it's a manner of being, it's an embodiment. The Grail is within. It's also in between, it's within you, and can also be upon the land, whether seen or unseen.
There was a story. He was a Jungian analyst. He was in his 80s. We were having a conversation about collective shadow. This is many years ago. I was trying to be really impressive, demonstrating how much I understood. And he just let me talk. He was quiet for a long time. Finally, he said something like, you know a great deal, but you haven't been broken yet. And until you are, all this remains theory. That was devastating to me, but it was completely accurate.
How old were you? Do you recall?
Oh, I was probably about 40 years of age. Wisdom isn't about knowing things. It's about what's been metabolized through lived suffering, through consequence, through failure. And you can feel it when you're in the presence of someone who has it. There's a quality of groundedness, of undefended presence, of being able to hold paradox without needing to resolve it. I'm not trying to convince you of anything. I'm not performing. I'm just here. I'm solid, clear. I'm humble, but I don't encounter that quality very often now. Most of what passes for wisdom, especially in spiritual and psychological communities, is sophisticated ego using spiritual language. Yeah, there are people who've read a lot, who can reference a lot. I've been one of those people, but there's no depth. There's no depth beneath it. There's no lived cost, no scars. Because the elders who carry wisdom, I sense they're mostly invisible now. They're not online. They're not building platforms. They're not monetizing insights. They're quietly doing the work. If you're lucky enough to stumble into their orbit, which I have, and unfortunately he's passed away now, you might receive something real, but you have to seek them out. That's part of the crisis. Wisdom can't scale. It can't be packaged. Our culture wants everything to be pre-packaged and consumed. It can't be transmitted through content. It requires direct content, time, and relationship. But our entire culture is structured to make that kind of transmission almost impossible. So what happens to a civilization that has more information than ever, but less wisdom than ever? It collapses, doesn't it? Isn't that the historical pattern? Rome, in its late stage, showed exactly this. The old gods lost their power. Rituals became empty spectacle. Meaning collapsed into entertainment. And the population became volatile, fragmented, addicted to stimulus. Oh, isn't this a pattern that we see today? The emperors grew increasingly narcissistic, classic ClusterB, and a civilization dissolved, not through conquest primarily, but through inner disintegration. So are we running that same pattern at digital velocity? because we've got extraordinary technological power, but we can't regulate our own nervous systems. We can't make decisions for the long term. We can't be in right relationship with each other or the earth. That's not a wisdom problem. That's a wisdom catastrophe.
It's a soul loss. It's a soul
Yeah.
sickness. Martin Luther King, he said something along the lines, going back to the 60s, we have guided missiles, but misguided men.
Oh. You talked about the Grail, and there's a mythological pattern every traditional culture understood. And you reference when the king is wounded and cannot heal, the entire land becomes barren, which is the Fisher King story from the Grail legends. The Fisher King is the guardian of the Holy Grail, but he's been wounded. And from what I understand, it's usually in the thigh or genitals, which suggests a wound to vitality, creative power. He cannot heal and cannot die, stuck in living death. The king's health is magically linked to the land. His wound spreads, crops fail, waters go stagnant, and women cannot conceive. So the kingdom, as you said, becomes a wasteland. This is not through invasion, it's through the wound in consciousness itself. Does not the king, correct me if I'm wrong here, because you know a lot about the Grail. So the king represents the dominant consciousness of the culture. When that's wounded, when the collective psyche is operating from trauma, reactivity, fragmentation, the wound spreads through everything. The ecological collapse and the psychological collapse, therefore, are not separate crises. They're the same wound manifesting at different scales. The inner wasteland and the outer wasteland are one. And I think this is crucial because the Grail legends also tell us that healing is possible. The wound can
Yes.
be transformed. But what are the requirements? It needs people to be conscious enough to see it, courageous enough to ask the right questions, but also humble enough to serve something larger than their own
Perfect.
healing. So, how
Exactly.
much of our spiritual seeking is actually avoidance of the kind of suffering that would forge wisdom?
I would say there's a good portion of people who are bypassing and not going to the depths. Maybe you've seen too, when they go to these workshops or they go to see their teacher, or in some cases, the wording is even that of a guru, which I really feel, if you look at the spelling of the guru, is Guru. It's not someone outside, it's really inside. If we listen to the falconer, the falcon cannot hear the falconer, to borrow from Yeats. But yeah, there's a bit of a sugar high when people cling to the guru and they have to go to all these workshops. And it's almost as if the other is going to fix me or make all right again. When really it's inside each, like I was saying, the grail is within, at least the potentiality is there within each and every one of us. Going back to the prophets, they would say, repent, which really what they meant is to learn to change your mind, change your heart, turn around.
Mm.
Behold, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. But then there was also another saying, the kingdom of heaven is upon the land, but men do not see it. It's here and now. If we pull back the veil, right? So apocalypse, Greek, means to pull back the veil of separateness, the veil of the machine is going to save us, when really the machine is the wound, is the trauma. And so the technology, like you were mentioning, that's not going to save us. If anything, it's leading us towards our ruin. The machine, the technology isn't going to heal a wounded soul, a soul sickness, a soul loss. So turn around from the machine. Turn back towards the center of self, other, place, and the cosmos. Turn back towards the garden. Turn back towards the sacred. Turn back towards the whole and holy. Human, humus, humility, whole and holy. Turn back towards the etymology of what it is to be a human being. Because in some cases, unfortunately, we're becoming more like a machine. And I think you were mentioning a while back that like children in particular are being raised by a machine, literally.
it's important to do the self-reflection work, do the inner work.
Not the type of self-reflection that many of us are doing today, that of narcissist, into the mirror.
No, not that kind of self-reflection. When I include myself, I've been doing consciousness work for 35 years. Analysis, psychedelics, evolutionary astrology, archetypal psychology, mythology. I've read Jung, Hillman, Rick Tarnas, the mystics, the depth psychologists. I know the maps. I can speak the language quite fluently. And yet, how much of that, and this is a self-reflection, and yet how much of that has been in service of actual transformation versus managing my own terror of being broken by life. There's a way that one can use spiritual practice as a shield. You can do all the inner work, the shadow integration, and it can still be a form of sophisticated control. The ego saying, hey, if I process this enough and understand it deeply enough and I integrate it thoroughly enough, then maybe I won't have to actually lose anything. Maybe I can transform without being destroyed. But wisdom doesn't work that way. Wisdom comes from lived experiences that shatter you. And I have been shattered, that strip away everything you thought you knew. I've had that too. That force you to rebuild from the ground up. I've had that too. You can't schedule that. You can't curate that. You can't process your way into it. But what I'm seeing constantly in spiritual communities is people are incredibly psychologically sophisticated who can talk about shadow and trauma and ego dissolution with real nuance. But have they actually lost anything irretrievable? Have they ever been genuinely humbled by life? Have they ever had the bottom drop out in a way that can't be fixed with the right ecology of practices or insight? Their wisdom is potentially theoretical, borrowed from books rather than earned through consequences. And I include myself in that. There are experiences I've been avoiding my whole life, certain kinds of failure, loss, confrontation with my own limitation. I've used spiritual seeking to bypass. Because if I'm always working on myself, always in process, always getting clearer, I never really have to face the thing that would actually break me open, as that Jungian analyst said to me. The hard question is whether real wisdom is even possible without that breaking, whether the soul can mature without being genuinely defeated by life at some point. And if that's true, then most of what we call consciousness work is actually consciousness avoidance. So we're treating it like an optimization project when it's supposed to be an initiation. An initiation requires death, real death, not metaphorical death, not the ones you journal about, death of the self you thought you were. Almost nobody I know is willing to submit to that.
I often feel that the people who have experienced death and resurrection, perhaps they didn't go into it all that informed and willingly. It's almost as if life, the sacred, called them into it. What's that old saying? Life happens? I would say it's something along those lines. But when it comes to the psyche, when it comes to the soul, one being broken open, their heart, their mind being broken open, there's a type of alchemy that takes place, a death and a resurrection.
James Hillman understood this, and you mentioned soul loss earlier, and he talked about soul making as opposed to cure. So the goal isn't to fix ourselves, is not to go by the way of the mechanic, and it's not an either or, because sometimes you need the mechanic to give you better tools to tend to your garden. The goal isn't to fix ourselves, it's to optimize ourselves. The goal is to deepen, to complexify, to become more fully who we already are including the shadow, including the wound, including the limitation. So soul making happens through straddling paradox, staying with the difficulty, not transcending it. And Jung understood that through individuation, real psychological maturation, which is the work of the second half of life. You can't individuate at 25. You don't have enough failure. You don't have enough loss. You don't have enough humility yet. So individuation requires having been broken by life and choosing to integrate the pieces rather than deny them. Jung talked about the poor and the senex, poor being the eternal youth, all potential, no realization, all beginning, no completion. It's springtime, full of ideas. It's ignition, which is what spring is, but utterly unable to commit or finish anything, allergic to limitation and responsibility. Whereas the Senex is the old king, the wise elder who holds structure, limitation, time, patience, the capacity to actually complete something. Our entire civilization is poor possessed. We're addicted to novelty, to potential, to the next thing. We refuse limitation. We refuse aging. We refuse or don't talk about death. But we have no senex anywhere. There are no elders who can hold boundaries, who can say no, who can demand you grow up and face consequence. Just a bunch of wounded children with smartphones. But here's the hope. We can fill the absence. We can name what's missing. The soul that knows. The soul that knows it's lost can begin finding its way home. I think the recognition of poor possession is already the beginning of Senex returning.
Ask the right questions.
So what's being asked of us? We have to get ruthlessly practical. It's not enough to diagnose the problem. We need to understand the response that's adequate to this. This can't be another self-help program. It can't be another 5 steps to enlightenment package, because the problem is precisely that modern consciousness wants everything fast, easy, painless, guaranteed. That's the ClusterB trap. I know from experience, real initiation doesn't work that way. We're looking for practices that directly confront the mechanisms of ClusterB dominance. These are practices that restore regulation, that rebuild capacity for sustained attention and for embodied presence, for humble not knowing. Can we generate practices that reconnect us to consequence, to limitation, to the sacred, to each other in ways that aren't performative?
I would say that these practices had been around for 97 to 99% of our species' experience here on Earth for the past 100 to 300,000 years. We can return to some of those. And I would also say that some of the people you mentioned, the true teachers of wisdom who are a little obscure from the mainstream nowadays, those are the current saints, the current wild saints of our time. The wild saints, the mainstream probably saw them as outcasts because they were stepping away from the machine and they found themselves in the desert.
And history's full of those characters.
Our practice while we're alive on Earth is a practice of moving towards wholeness, towards being a human being, and perhaps also being something more saint-like and a wild saint. Religio, to reconnect the sacred that's within, in between, with other, and place. Those are a few practices that come to my mind as far as how do we do this? But also ask why, not just how and what, but why. And perhaps also ask the question, not only what ails the culture, but perhaps what ails me? What wound is left unhealed? And Jung, what myth am I living and what is it serving? Is it in service to the sacred? Is it in service to good, beauty, and truth? If we want something better than the current state and the current trajectory and the likely outcome, the loss of our remaining humanity and much of the loss of the living world. If we don't want that, at least 90, if not 180 degrees opposite, course correct. There's two choices here. There's no third in my eyes. Choose life or choose something that's going to be anti-life, anti-soul. Now, this isn't just for oneself or one's lifetime. This is for all following generations and not just us two-legged beings. This is for all your relations, the whole tapestry of the living world.
I said to a client yesterday, you can't yoga your way out of this. Because her whole thing was, I got to do yoga to get regulated. But there's a deeper issue. The question I proffered for her consciousness was, how do you discern transformative practice from practice that's identity management? The tell is this: transformative practice creates discomfort that leads to genuine humility. You could say yoga does create discomfort. Of course it does. But it creates a certain comfort that reinforces the story you have about yourself. Transformative practice confronts you with your patterns, your defenses, your avoidances. Remember, I told you the story about the workshop I did in Wales. It confronted my patterns, my defenses, my avoidances. It didn't let me off the hook. It stripped away pretense. Now, that's excruciating, because identity management gives you new language to describe yourself and new communities to belong to and new evidence you're doing important work. But nothing fundamentally changes. You just get better at managing your image, even if that image is authentic, spiritual seeker. The question is your practice making you more humbled or more entitled? Secondly, is it increasing your capacity to be with difficulty, or is it giving you sophisticated ways to avoid difficulty? Is it connecting you to something larger, or is it reinforcing your personal narrative? You've got to be brutally honest. Your ego is so sophisticated, it can co-opt any practice and turn it into another way to avoid transformation whilst it appears that you're pursuing it.
Peter, I would also add, and maybe you have, I would ask something along the lines, is your practice aiding in having and embodying more compassion and feeling suffering, that of another, and perhaps much of the world? This is what I've noticed myself. There's a number of people who are avoidant of much of the darkness. It's almost as if they just want to look and think of the light only. What did Carl Jung say? You can't, thinking of light devoid of darkness is not going to get you to the destination that one might be thinking of. I'm paraphrasing, but Jung said something along those lines, that by avoiding the darkness, by avoiding suffering, we're going to have more of the same, really. We're not considering the whole. It's almost like we're cherry picking, we're editing, and we're excluding. It's a form of denial, a form of escapism. And so it reminds me of supposedly the story of the Titanic, that there was a few string musicians that during the Titanic's last moments before being fully submerged, they were playing a string hymn. They were looking at their fate, but they were still holding on to the light, the good, the beauty, and the truth. So we can have both at the same time. It's not easy, of course.
That's the paradox. That's staying with difficulty.
Yeah.
Practices need to be initiatory. I was saying to my client, think of your practice as initiatory. They're meant to be difficult. In the lens of coherence, the lens of practice, firstly, track possession states in real time. If you're feeling intensity rising, like rage and righteousness and victimhood and grandiosity, pause, turn your observer on and ask, which archetype has me right now? Name it specifically. Is it the wounded child demanding to be seen? Is it the righteous warrior defending territory? Is it the abandoned lover, the inflated hero? And again, don't judge it, don't fix it, name it. and feel where it lives in the body. The act of naming creates distance between you and the possession. But you've got to do this daily. You've got to be consistent. You've got to write down pen and paper with what you notice, because patterns once seen becomes patterns that can be worked with.
You can manage them.
Secondly, find friction through relationship. What do I mean? Find 3 people who are not in your usual echo chamber, people who think differently to you, who'll challenge you, who won't just validate your perspective. And I'm not talking about hostile people, the gotcha kind of, or wanting to make you wrong so they can be right, but genuinely other. Once a month, have a conversation about something you disagree on. You must steel man their position before responding, articulate their views so well, they say, yes, that's exactly what I mean, before you share your perspective. If you want to understand a Native American, walk in their moccasins for 2 moons. This interrupter splitting, the tendency to reduce everything to us versus them, interrupts ClusterB circuitry that makes complexity into melodrama, and it's excruciating, but do it anyway. Thirdly, map your nervous system. This is somatic work. For 14 days, stop 3 times and notice, am I dysregulated? And if I am dysregulated, what's the quality? Is it escalating towards fight or flight? Or is it collapsing into freeze or fawn? What triggered it? What sensations are present? Don't fix it, track it, trace it, evaluate it. After 14 days, you'll have a map of your patterns. Then the real work begins. Because when you catch yourself dysregulating, you have about 3 seconds where choice is possible. Can you catch it? Can you interrupt the pattern? Can you choose differently? This builds new circuitry. And yeah, it's slow. It's not glamorous, but it's absolutely necessary. They're not comfortable practices, but they're not meant to be, because comfort is what got us here. We've got to move from comfort to capacity. We've got to create the friction that changes circuitry, that builds capacity, that reconnects us to what's real. From over 30 years experience, every person I've worked with who's done this work, and I don't do it for them, they become a pillar in the temple that doesn't exist yet, but desperately needs to. They become part of the container that can hold collective transformation. This isn't individual work in the sense of fixing yourself. It's individual work in service of collective healing. When you change your circuitry, you change the field. You become a node of coherence in a dysregulated system. If enough people do that, not perfectly, but consistently, we begin to see the emergence of new structures, new containers, new possibilities.
A vital person helps to vitalize, as Joseph Campbell said. So I said that there's pretty much 2 options here. Choose life or choose anti-life. Those are the options.
Those 2 options are important. You choose life, you choose practice. Without practice, it becomes another beautiful idea. The practices would need to include dimensions we haven't even named yet. You talked about re-enchantment. My mind immediately goes to practices of re-enchantment, not as fantasies or belief, but as direct perception. We have to step into the halls of perception. Is it difficult? Is it challenging? You bet your ass it is.
Nothing worth having comes to us easily, let alone free. And I would say this requires everything. It requires at least much, and perhaps for some, everything. But it's worth it.
Yes.
Because what's the option? It's basically anti-life, or more or less a hell on earth. How's that working?
When you showed me that photograph of you at the, where was it?
Canyon Creek.
Canyon Creek. I was looking at that shot. I love photography, and I was looking at the image on my computer, and there's something about spending time in wild places. I sensed you feel the aliveness that's always been there. When I've gone out as a photographer, a landscape photographer, I've learned to perceive nature not as scenery or resource, but
A
as
cathedral.
subject, yeah, as thou, as sacred presence. And this isn't animism as a primitive belief system, it's animism as accurate perception of what is. If we can have practices of cosmological reorientation, learning to feel yourself as earth, as stardust, as the universe's 13.8 billion year journey momentarily concentrated in this particular nervous system, not as concept, but as somatic reality. And when you can feel that, when you can feel your body as cosmos, your breath is the same breath that moves through all life, regulation happens naturally because you're no longer an isolated nervous system desperately trying to maintain coherence. You, me, we are an expression of a larger coherence that we can all participate in.
You are really hitting on something. Are you familiar with the NASA astronomer Michelle Haller?
No.
So Michelle Thaler talks about what you just mentioned through her NASA astronomy lens. So she gives a TED talk about this, and the TED talk is "We Are Dead Stars." And basically it's this. She says, when you look up at the stars in the night sky, in some ways, if not many ways, you're looking back at yourself.
What's her name
Because
again?
Michelle Thaler, what she's getting at is all the elements within the periodic table, all the elements that are on this living biosphere, the elements that are also within us, iron for one, that helps to make the blood in our veins and our bodies appear to be red. That came by way of a death of a star, an exploding star. So that's called stellar nucleosynthesis. All that stellar matter that's created from the death of the star, from the exploding star, eventually forms a mass and sometimes planets and us, the Earth. We're in nature and nature's in us. We're in the cosmos and the cosmos is within us. I would also put thou there as well.
Now you mentioned this, these are practices of listening to what is not you, dreams and synchronicities, the way reality speaks through symbol, pattern, and uncanny timing. Jung called this the objective psyche, the dimension of psyche that exists independently of our personal consciousness. When we learn to attend to this, to take it seriously, let it guide us, this is how we rebuild a relationship with our soul. Practices of mythopoetic consciousness, or learning to see your life not just psychologically, but mythologically and cosmologically. When we recognize that the same archetypal patterns that move through ancient stories are moving through us right now. So I'm not just Peter, the astrologer therapist having psychological experiences. I'm Psyche in the underworld. As you mentioned, Odysseus trying to find home. When I can see this mythologically, I have access to meaning that psychology alone cannot provide. Practices of deep time, connecting to ancestors, to future generations, to the geological timescales that shape the ground beneath our feet, to the evolutionary journey that produced our consciousness. When we can feel ourselves as a momentary expression of deep time, the urgency of the present moment doesn't disappear, but it gets contextualized by something so much larger that wisdom becomes accessible again. And I'm not talking about new age spirituality or cultural yuck. This is older than religion. They're how humans stayed sane for 95% of our existence as a species by staying in relationship with an ensouled cosmos. We've lost
Absolutely.
that relationship during the Enlightenment, and we've been trying to survive without it ever since. We're discovering we can't. The nervous system cannot remain regulated in a dead cosmos, and the psyche cannot mature in isolation. So wisdom cannot emerge without soul.
Absolutely. Absolutely. When I go hiking and backpacking, as you saw in the picture, for me, it's a return from this modern world back to the really real in a time before time. It's a form of medicine, but it doesn't always have to be a particular hiking destination. This also can be within our minds and hearts as well.
To gather what we've walked through, Corey, we started at the material level. We've looked at how modern civilization creates conditions that mass produce ClusterB psychology. We talked about the instability, the overstimulation, the fragmentation, the collapse of eldership and initiation. We explored the contagion mechanism and why this psychology spreads so effectively and how emotional states synchronize across populations, why mobs form so easily, why we're all susceptible to collective possession. I think it's the not knowing is itself, it's part of the initiation, because certainty is a luxury we don't have. I sense we're in a liminal space now. This is the threshold between what was and what might be.
Yes.
And I sense for many people, it's deeply uncomfortable because every cell wants resolution. Human beings want certainty. They want to know, how does this turn out? But I see that genuine initiation always involves this period of not knowing. The old self has died, but the new self hasn't fully formed. I sense we're in the darkness between forms, but the work is to stay in that darkness with consciousness, to keep doing the practices, to see, even where we can't see where they're leading, and to trust that transformation is happening, even when it feels like falling apart. We are in genuine crisis. ClusterB dominance is real and dangerous. And the loss of wisdom is catastrophic, to say the least. But the crisis is also the teacher. It's showing us exactly what needs to die and exactly what needs to be born. And as you say, we get to choose in each moment, with each practice, with each conversation, whether we participate in the death of the consciousness or get swept away by it. That choice is everything. It's available to us right now. It's the greatest gift we've been given. The gift of choice. It's always available. Every time we make that choice, the field shifts a little. The container gets a little stronger. The seed of what comes next gets a little more nourishment. I'm very grateful to them because they're willing to do this work, to stay conscious through the dissolution, to participate in what wants to be born and to become that bridge between worlds.
Who do we want to be, and who do we need at the end of the world, the end of our lifetime, and perhaps the life of the whole living world? Who do we need at our twilight, and perhaps the twilight of everything?
Beautiful. Thank you, Corey, for another fantastic conversation. I always learn so much more when we have these dialogues.
Likewise. It's wonderful as always, Peter. Thank you. Thank your audience as well.